Hello, I'm Kate Meller, and 25 years ago I invented Robert Pinnacle and took him around the spa sounds of Europe. I'd always been quite interested in the work of Ingrid Pollard, who'd done a piece of work called Histories, where she'd taken items from a museum and just wrote a complete fabricated story about it. And so I thought, well, I'll maybe do something a bit like that, but I'll invent a bogus artist and create a story, and I'll invent myself as his kind of follower and do work that I follow in his footsteps, and I'll write his bogus stories, and people kind of believed in him. It was quite fun doing it, but spa towns do have their horrible side. There's a lot of sadness and grief and death and disease. There's a photograph that I took in Spa, the eponymous spa, that gave its name to all the spa towns. And everybody who stayed there, the monarchs, all the great and the good, the poets, musicians, the artists who made it, and they all have their names in gold. I put his name, Robert Pinnacle, it's a silly name, but that's what he was like. Nobody would think anything of it now, but back in the 90s they did. And I put Robert Pinnacle's name up there in the photograph, and people would say, oh then, but how did you do that? And he really does exist, which is the point. And I'd say, well, I did it with Photoshop, of course. And they'd say, oh, of course you did. And well, nobody would do that now because they'd be used to it. But then it was early days, and people would be totally phased. Like at the end of the show, people would be let in on the conceit, and I'd have a little strip which would say Robert Pinnacle was a made-up character, a fictional character, and there are a lot of people like him throughout history. And people would genuinely appreciate it, that he was a fictional character. I found that the interest in spa towns, it's never quite left me, and I'm always grateful to be asked to have gone on that project, particularly because that's when I discovered how to use a pinhole camera, which I've been using ever since. And what I particularly like about the pinhole camera is that people aren't frightened of it. Because people come up and ask me about it, because they know that I'm not going to put a pinhole photograph on Facebook or anything like that. And so, yeah, I've had a lot of conversations over the years because people aren't frightened of a little wooden box. You get a really beautiful hazy effect if you use a pinhole camera. I really like the fact that people disappear if they are in front of a pinhole camera, and a lot of people tend to walk in front of a pinhole camera because of the long time exposure. and in history people disappear. They fail to register, and people in front of the camera fail to register. They seem to come together. The ancient prehistory of photography with the camera and the history of the Spartans, they seem to meld in a way.
It's not strictly true to say that Harrogate spring waters were discovered 450 years ago. Local people have been using Harrogate's various springs and wells for centuries, but in 1571, a gentleman by the name of William Slingsby recognised the similarities between that of our springs and those of the fast-growing spa towns of Europe. This led to the development of Harrogate as one of Britain's leading spa towns. In fact, Harrogate was the first town in the world to be described as a spa-like town. Harrogate Spa's story began here in Elizabethan times. William Slingsby lived locally to the Tuit well, known for the lapwings, or the pewits, as the locals call them, that fed on the salty deposits around the spring's edges. In his youth, Slingsby had travelled to Europe and been to the town of Spa in what's now Belgium, and recognised the similarities between our springs and theirs. He also recognised the potential for the medicinal therapeutic benefits that the chalybeate, or the iron springs, could bring. The luxurious royal baths were the pinnacle of Harrogate spa building achievements. Opened in 1897, these offered a whole menu of over 40 different treatments. Harrogate and the royal baths in particular have become a centre for international hydrotherapy with a reputation worldwide. Although the earliest cure seekers drank directly from the source, soon enterprising local businessmen took it upon themselves to open up hotels, bathhouses, promenade rooms and pump rooms to cater for the fashionable and wealthy visitors travelling in here for the spa trade. Soon Harrogate became one of the most important spa towns in Britain. The spa waters are reputed to have medicinal benefits due to the minerals they acquired as they filtered through the subterranean rock layers. These were split in three categories: chalybeate, saline and sulphurous, or sweet, tart and stinking. Chalybeate contains dissolved iron, saline sodium chloride and or magnesium, but the much less common, most valuable considered by spa physicians, were the sulphur waters. As word spread of Harrogate's mineral waters, it wasn't long before physicians were promoting its use in the hope of curing all manner of medical ailments and illnesses, from nightmares, plague, rickets, gout, female complaints, to name but a few. But perhaps a few weeks of fresh air, plain food and exercise gave as much of a revitalising effect as taking the waters themselves. But it is true, for external use on certain skin conditions, sulphur can be beneficial. Modern-day clinical trials have proven that bathing in it not only reduces the heart rate, but also boosts the immune system, so it's not all poppycock and snake oil. Plus, around 80% of Victorians suffer from some form of intestinal parasites, so before modern-day medicine, this really was the next best thing. In one of Harrogate's earliest spa buildings, we're celebrating 450 years of our mineral springs. Built in 1806, the promenade rooms offered a social gathering place for visitors attending the old sulphur well. Today it houses the Mercer Art Gallery, and a brand new exhibition is being assembled to mark this significant story. Historic prints and drawings reveal how the famous waters moulded Harrogate into a spa town, and artworks by some of Britain's leading contemporary artists connect to broader themes of spas and bathing, history and health.
I'm Serena Partridge. I'm a textile artist based in Malton, and I did a residency here in Harrogate, specifically with the Royal Pump Room Museum in 2009 and 2010. So the residency was one of 6 residencies that took place over North Yorkshire in very different venues, but all heritage venues. on looking around the Pump Room Museum, seeing a quote by Charles Dickens really excited my interest in the town and visitors to the town and residents of the town. So the quote was, "Harrogate is the queerest place with the strangest people leading the oddest lives of dancing, newspaper reading and dining." So that led me to start to look at the ephemera in the collection and look at, one of the first things I looked at was the big visitors book, and everyone who came and all the kind of tourist information and the pamphlets and leaflets and postcards that were sent out. So a lot of the buildings and trying to get an idea of what people did when they came to Harrogate. So I got really engrossed in all the research in Harrogate, and was the more I dug, the more sort of clues I found, if you like, more evidence. But it got to a stage where I had to draw a line and start making. So for the residency I made 7 glove pieces. So there's 1 pair of gloves and then 6 individual gloves. Each of the gloves they're not true size, they're about 2/3 scale. And that's partly like a trick to just unsettle the viewer a little bit, so they're not quite sure what they're looking at, whether it is an original artefact or not. And also it's a little nod to when you visit museums, how you can often overhear people saying, "Oh, look how tiny their hands were," or "Look how tiny their feet were." They could actually be real objects. The first ones I made were the 2 that are here in the exhibition. So one is souvenir day glove, and then the other is souvenir evening glove. And they were also inspired by a glove I found that's in the National Archives by a gentleman called George Shove. He'd made up a glove with a map on for the Great Exhibition in 1851 at Crystal Palace, and it also had little printed architecture of Buckingham Palace, and it had I think Westminster Abbey on it, St Paul's, and the idea is that people would be able to find their way around London after the exhibition. I don't think this glove was ever mass produced. One of the reasons I've said, I don't know how true this is, but is that it would aid women's mobility too much for them to find their own way around London. It was actually quite, didn't have a lot of the streets on, so I don't know whether it was more of a novelty souvenir, really. So with Harrogate being an exhibition town, it seemed to really tie nicely in all the postcards and the buildings I'd been looking at, to take this idea of a souvenir glove, but a way of finding your way around Harrogate as a visitor. So the day glove has all the kind of places that you might want to visit in the day. So it's got the spa, it's got the hospital, all the places you might go for your health. And then the evening glove, which is a longer sort of opera style glove, has the places where you might go to the balls or to the theatre. The threads I've used are, well, for the buildings I've used gossamer silk thread, which is really, really fine, but then for the lettering I've split it down even finer to 1 strand, so I can fit that lettering on. I tend to make drawings of the buildings and then photocopy them down to a really tiny scale, and then prick through a little paper template. So I've got lots of little holes on the gloves that I almost then do dot to dot and join together with thread to make up the building, as far as I can see. Some of it is just done by eye. So I've always worked on a small scale, and I remember as a child entering lots of local horticultural shows, and I was especially excited to do miniature gardens, make miniature gardens, and also flower arrangements in unusual containers. So I remember once going for a recorder and selecting lots of very teeny tiny flowers to go in all the little recorder holes. So it's something that's always fascinated me, small scale and kind of something a bit otherworldly.